He thought the security cameras in his own office were decorative. Marcus Voss, CEO of Voss Halden Development, had his hands in the hair of a woman who wasn't his wife. 31 floors above the city, he was quietly buying piece by piece. He believed his 8 months pregnant wife, Claire, was at home, resting, exactly where he'd left her that morning, with a kiss on the forehead and a lie on his lips. He was wrong. Because at that exact moment, Claire was standing in the doorway of his office, close enough to hear the woman laugh. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She reached down, slid the ring off her finger, a ring he'd once told her cost more than her father made in a year, and set it on the corner of his desk without making a sound. By the time Marcus turned around, she was already gone. What he found on that desk wasn't just a ring. It was the first move in a war he didn't know he was losing. The executive floor of Voss Halden Development occupied the top 3 levels of a glass tower overlooking the harbor, a building Marcus himself had championed as the company's crown jewel 4 years earlier. He liked to tell investors that a man who could see the entire skyline from his desk had earned the right to reshape it. At 41, Marcus was the kind of man who measured success in square footage and closing costs. He'd taken his father's modest construction company and turned it into a regional real estate empire. The kind of man magazines love to photograph standing in front of half-finished skyscrapers with his arms crossed, looking like he owned the sky itself. That Thursday afternoon, he stood behind his desk with his tie loosened and a glass of scotch, sweating a ring onto a stack of zoning documents. In front of him, perched on the edge of his desk with her heels already kicked off, was Renata Cole, 32, the newest director of marketing at Voss Halden. Hired 6 months earlier over the objections of the head of HR, who'd quietly flagged the hire as unusually fast-tracked. "You're playing with fire," Renata said, tracing a finger along the rim of her glass. "What if she shows up?" "She won't," Marcus said, setting his drink down and stepping closer. "She's at home. Doctor put her on modified bed rest last week. Besides, she thinks I'm in a permit negotiation with the city planning board until 6. "And after 6? "After 6, Marcus said, his voice dropping. "I don't think about her at all." He didn't hear the elevator chime down the hall. He didn't hear the soft click of low heels on marble, a sound he would have recognized anywhere if he'd been listening for it. The particular rhythm of his wife's walk, slower now, careful, a woman 8 months into carrying his child. Claire Voss had come to surprise him. She'd spent the morning fighting off nausea and boredom in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. And around 2 in the afternoon, on impulse, she'd decided that maybe what she needed wasn't more bed rest. Maybe what she needed was to see her husband's face when she told him the ultrasound tech thought she'd caught a glimpse of dark hair, the same shade as his. She'd brought the photo. It was still in her purse when she reached his office door, slightly ajar, and heard a woman's laugh that didn't belong to anyone on his staff she recognized. She didn't storm in. Some instinct, older and colder than heartbreak, told her to stop, to look first, to know exactly what she was walking into before she made a single sound. Through the 2-inch gap in the door, she watched her husband's hands slide into another woman's hair. She watched him kiss her the way he used to kiss Claire in the early years, before board meetings and quarterly reports replaced whatever they used to have. She watched for exactly 11 seconds, long enough to understand this wasn't the first time, long enough to notice how comfortable Renata looked sitting on that desk, like she'd sat there before. Then Claire did something that would later become the single most replayed detail of the entire scandal. She pushed the door open, just enough to step inside, walked to the desk without a word, slid off her wedding ring, a ring Marcus had proposed with on a rooftop in Barcelona 9 years earlier, and placed it silently on the corner of the desk, right beside his scotch. Neither of them noticed her until the door clicked shut behind her. By the time Marcus spun around, breathless, Renata scrambling to pull her blouse straight, Claire was already in the elevator, one hand resting protectively over her belly, watching the numbers count down through tears she refused to let fall until the doors closed completely. What Marcus didn't know, what he wouldn't learn until it was far too late to matter, was that Claire hadn't come to that office by accident that day. She'd been planning to come for 2 weeks, ever since she found a receipt in his coat pocket for a jewelry store he'd never taken her to. A receipt for a bracelet that never arrived at their house. She hadn't come to catch him. She'd come to give him one last chance to tell her the truth himself. He failed that test in the worst possible way a man can fail it. 6 hours earlier, at 7 that morning, the Voss residence sat quiet and immaculate on a bluff overlooking the water. A house Marcus had built specifically to be photographed for the cover of an architecture magazine. All glass and steel and cold, deliberate lines. Claire sat at the kitchen island, one hand wrapped around a mug of decaf, the other resting on the swell of her stomach, feeling their daughter shift beneath her palm. At 36, Claire had spent the last 11 years of her career as a licensed architect, the woman who'd actually drawn the blueprints for 3 of Voss Halden's flagship properties. Work that appeared under Marcus's name in every press release. Work she'd stopped correcting people about years ago because it was easier than fighting for credit in a marriage that had slowly stopped being a partnership. She watched Marcus move through the kitchen, checking his phone, straightening his cufflinks. A man performing the role of a devoted husband for an audience of exactly no one. Big day, she asked. Permit hearing for the Baywater project, Marcus said, not looking up. City's being difficult about the wetlands assessment. Might run late. The Baywater project, Claire repeated quietly. She knew that project. She'd flagged serious environmental concerns in the original site survey 8 months earlier, concerns Marcus had waved away with a phrase. She'd never forgotten. Sometimes you pay to make problems disappear. She hadn't understood then exactly what he meant. She was starting to. He kissed the top of her head on his way out, the same automatic gesture he'd performed every morning for the last 2 years, and left without once meeting her eyes. The moment the door closed, Claire didn't cry. She'd done enough of that over the last 2 months. Ever since the late nights multiplied, ever since his phone started living face down on every surface, ever since the man who used to text her from job sites just to say he missed her stopped texting her at all. She picked up her own phone and called someone she hadn't spoken to in 15 years outside of holiday cards. Grandpa Halden, she said when the line connected. I need to ask you something about the company. Very few people at Voss Halden Development remembered that the name on the building wasn't just Marcus's legacy. It was 2 names stitched together in a merger 22 years earlier, when a struggling contractor named Marcus's father partnered with an aging but respected developer named Theodore Halden, Claire's grandfather, to save both their failing firms. The merger agreement, buried in a filing cabinet nobody had opened in over a decade, guaranteed the Halden family a permanent seat on the board and a dormant 12% ownership stake that had never been diluted, never been bought out, and never, as far as Marcus was concerned, mattered at all. Claire had married into the Voss name. What almost nobody at that company remembered, including her own husband, was that she'd been born into the Halden half of it. You still have the seat, sweetheart, her grandfather said, his voice thin but sharp as ever. Nobody's ever asked me to give it up, and I never offered. Why do you ask? Because I think I'm about to need it, Claire said. At 9 that morning, while Marcus sat in a real permit hearing that would, in fact, run until nearly 6, Claire drove herself to the offices of Priya Anand, one of the most feared corporate litigators on the coast, a woman who'd built her reputation dismantling exactly the kind of empire Marcus had spent 2 decades constructing. I don't want a quiet divorce, Claire told her, sitting carefully in the leather chair across from Priya's desk, one hand still resting on her belly. I want to understand exactly what I'm walking into first. Because I think my husband has been breaking laws, not just vows. Priya leaned forward. Tell me everything. Claire told her about the wetlands assessment on the Baywater project, the one she'd personally flagged for serious contamination risk, the one that had somehow received emergency approval from the city planning board 4 days after Marcus took a city councilman on a private yacht trip that never appeared on any expense report Claire had ever seen. She told her about a folder she'd found 18 months earlier, half buried in his home office desk, containing wire transfer records to something called Sable Consulting LLC, an entity that, as far as Claire could tell, provided no actual consulting services to anyone. She told her about the ownership stake her grandfather still held, the one Marcus had forgotten existed. Priya Anand's expression shifted from sympathetic to something closer to hungry. Claire, she said slowly, if even half of what you're describing is real, this isn't just a divorce case. This is a securities fraud case, an environmental fraud case, and potentially a public corruption case. all wrapped around one very arrogant man who has no idea his wife just became the most dangerous person in his company. At noon, Claire sat in her car outside the courthouse, staring at the phone in her hand. She had one more call to make before she went home to wait. And it wasn't to Marcus. It was to Denise Whitfield, the 63-year-old executive assistant who had worked for Marcus's father before she ever worked for Marcus. A woman who had watched Marcus grow from an eager young protege into the kind of man who forgot her birthday 3 years running, and once made her cancel her own daughter's graduation dinner to rebook a client flight. Claire had never forgotten Denise's kindness during her difficult first trimester, the quiet gestures nobody else at the company bothered with, the ginger candies left on her desk, the covered for lunches when morning sickness hit during meetings. Denise, Claire said, I need a favor, and I need you to trust me completely before I explain why. By 2 in the afternoon, everything was in motion. Claire hadn't planned to walk in on Marcus that day. That part, the part that would become the defining image of the entire scandal, happened because Claire genuinely wanted to share good news with her husband before the storm she'd started building finally broke. She just hadn't expected to find the storm already waiting for her behind his office door. The silence after the elevator doors closed was the loudest thing Marcus had ever heard in his life. He stood frozen behind his desk, one hand still hovering in the air where Renata's hair had been a moment ago, staring at the small gold ring sitting innocently beside his scotch glass, like it had simply materialized out of nowhere. Was that? Renata started, her voice small. Get out, Marcus said, not looking at her. Marcus! Get out, Renata. Now! She grabbed her heels and her blouse and fled without another word, leaving Marcus alone with the ring, the scotch, and the sudden, suffocating understanding that his wife had just watched him become exactly the man his own father used to warn him never to be. He picked up the ring with trembling fingers, as if it might still be warm from her hand. He tried calling her 3 times before he even made it to the elevator. Straight to voicemail every time. By the time he reached the parking garage, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, a number he'd later learn belonged to Priya Anand's office. Mr. Voss, this is formal notice that you have been served electronically with a petition for dissolution of marriage, along with a temporary restraining order regarding all shared and company financial accounts. Physical service will follow within 24 hours. Please retain counsel immediately. Marcus stood in the garage, reading the message 3 times, feeling the ground tilt beneath him the way it hadn't since he was a 23-year-old kid watching his father's company nearly collapse for the first time. He called his lawyer. He called his chief financial officer. He called the bank. Every single line of credit tied to his personal accounts had been frozen within the last 90 minutes. Flagged for review pending an emergency court order Claire's attorney had apparently filed the moment Claire walked out of that office. Timed, Marcus would later realize with a sick twist in his stomach, before Claire had even known for certain what she'd catch him doing that day. She hadn't just walked in on an affair. She'd walked in with an entire legal apparatus already loaded and waiting, and his infidelity had simply pulled the trigger. At 4 that afternoon, an email went out to the entire board of Voss Halden Development, sent from an address Marcus didn't recognize, requesting an emergency shareholder meeting the following morning at 9 sharp, citing urgent governance concerns requiring immediate board action. The email was signed by Claire Halden Voss, 12% shareholder and permanent Halden family board designee. Marcus read it standing in the same parking garage, 3 hours after his wife had silently removed her wedding ring in front of him, and finally understood, with the particular horror of a man realizing he's already lost a war he didn't know had started, that Claire wasn't just his wife. She was, and had always been, the one person inside his own company with the legal standing to burn it down around him. The following morning, the boardroom at Voss Halden's headquarters filled slowly, board members arriving with the confused, wary energy of people summoned to a meeting nobody could explain. Marcus arrived first, unshaven, his usual confidence replaced by a brittle, sleepless tension. He'd spent the night in a hotel, having found his key card to the house deactivated the moment he tried to return home. A discovery he made standing on his own front porch at 11 at night while a private security guard, one Claire had hired that afternoon, politely informed him that Mrs. Voss's attorney had already filed the appropriate paperwork. He'd tried calling his father's old business partner for advice, forgetting, in his panic, that his father's old business partner was Theodore Halden, the man whose granddaughter had just filed to dissolve his marriage. At 9 sharp, Claire walked into the boardroom. She wore a structured navy dress, her hair pulled back, a folder tucked under one arm, moving with the careful, deliberate grace of a woman 8 months pregnant, who refused to let anyone in that room mistake her condition for fragility. Beside her walked Priya Anand, and behind them both, wheeled in by an assistant, was a rolling cart stacked with 3 thick binders. "Claire," Marcus said, standing. "What is this?" "Sit down, Marcus," Claire said, her voice calm in a way that unsettled the room far more than shouting would have. "This concerns all of us." She didn't sit at the foot of the table where spouses were traditionally seated for the occasional company function. She sat at the head, directly across from the chairman, a seat that had been vacant since her grandfather stopped attending meetings in person years ago. "Gentlemen," Claire began, addressing the 8 stunned board members. 18 months ago, I discovered a pattern of wire transfers from company accounts to an entity called Sable Consulting LLC, totaling just under $4 million, for services that, as far as I can determine, were never actually rendered. Priya distributed the first binder. Pages turned. A murmur moved through the room. "Sable Consulting," Claire continued, "is registered to a P.O. box in a state with no corporate transparency requirements. Its sole listed officer shares a last name with a city councilman who, for days after receiving a private yacht excursion from my husband, personally expedited emergency approval of the Baywater Development's wetlands assessment, an assessment I flagged 8 months earlier as containing serious, unaddressed contamination risk." "This is outrageous," Marcus said, half rising. "You're twisting a routine consulting arrangement into some kind of conspiracy because you're angry about." "Sit down, Mr. Voss," the chairman said quietly, not looking up from the binder. Claire continued, her voice never wavering. "The second binder contains 3 years of internal emails in which my husband instructed staff to suppress or reroute environmental compliance concerns, including my own professional assessments, submitted under my licensed architectural stamp, which were altered after submission to remove specific contamination warnings before being filed with the city. That detail landed harder than anything before it. Altering a licensed professional's stamped assessment wasn't just an ethics violation. It was a felony. "You can't prove I altered anything," Marcus snapped, but his voice had lost its certainty. "I can," Claire said, "because I kept the originals. Every single one time-stamped, in a personal archive I started maintaining 14 months ago, when I first noticed the discrepancies between what I submitted and what the city actually received." A board member near the end of the table, a quiet woman named Sandra Whitmore who had served on the board for over a decade without ever once challenging Marcus publicly, finally spoke. "Claire, why now? Why not go to the authorities directly instead of bringing this here?" Claire's hand moved instinctively to her belly. "Because I wanted to give this company one chance to fix itself before this becomes a criminal matter that destroys every job in this building, not just my husband's. I'm not here for revenge, Sandra. I'm here to save what my grandfather built before my husband finishes burying it." The chairman closed the binder in front of him. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Immediate removal of Marcus Voss as chief executive, effective this meeting," Claire said. "A full independent forensic audit of Sable Consulting and every transaction connected to the Baywater approval. And given my licensing background, my direct oversight of the environmental remediation process required to correct the falsified assessment, before anyone else's family ends up living next to a contamination site my husband paid a city official to ignore." The vote took less than 4 minutes. Every hand went up except Marcus's own. Marcus sat frozen at the far end of the table he'd once dominated, watching people he had personally hired, personally promoted, personally trusted, vote unanimously to remove him from the company that carried his name. "This is my company," he said, his voice cracking. "My father built this from nothing." "Your father built this with my grandfather," Claire said quietly, standing, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. "You just forgot that somewhere along the way. The same way you forgot a lot of things." Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down instinctively, the old habit refusing to die even now, and saw a text from Renata. They froze my accounts too. Miller's guy called me last night. Said if I sign a statement about the yacht trip and the false invoices, I stay out of the fraud case. I'm sorry, Marcus. I have to protect myself. He looked up from the phone to find the boardroom already emptying around him. Board members filing out in careful silence, unwilling to meet his eyes, unwilling to be photographed anywhere near the man whose name was about to be removed from the letterhead by the end of the week. Only Claire remained, gathering her binders with the same steady calm she'd carried since the moment she'd set that ring down on his desk. Claire, Marcus said, his voice breaking completely now. Please. The baby. We can figure this out. I'll fix it. I'll fix everything. Claire paused at the door, one hand on the frame, the other cradling the weight of the daughter she was still, despite everything, determined to protect. You had every day of the last 9 years to fix things, Marcus, she said. You chose a desk and a woman half your age instead. Don't confuse consequences for cruelty. I'm not punishing you. I'm just finally putting down something I should have set down a long time ago. She left him standing alone in the boardroom. The same room where he'd once announced record profits to a standing ovation. Now empty except for the faint scent of her perfume and the sound of his own ragged breathing. The weeks that followed unraveled Marcus's life with a speed that left him dizzy. The forensic audit confirmed everything Claire had presented and uncovered more. Nearly $7 million in total diverted through Sable Consulting over 3 years, funding not just the Baywater bribery, but a second undisclosed property Marcus had purchased for Renata under a shell corporation 11 months earlier, a fact that made national business news the same week the district attorney's office opened a formal investigation into the wetlands approval. Renata, true to her text, cooperated fully with prosecutors within days, trading her testimony about the yacht trip and the falsified invoices for immunity from the fraud charges. She left the city within a month, and Marcus never heard from her again. The Halden name, dormant for over a decade, returned to public prominence when the board formally installed Claire as interim chief executive, a decision that sent Voss Halden's battered stock climbing 11% in a single day. Investors relieved to see an architect with an actual professional license, and an actual paper trail of ethical objections finally in charge of a company that badly needed one. Marcus, stripped of his position, his marriage, and facing a criminal investigation that would eventually result in a plea deal involving restitution and a suspended sentence, moved into a modest rental across town, the kind of apartment he hadn't lived in since his 20s. 6 weeks after the boardroom vote, Claire gave birth to a daughter, Josephine, in a quiet hospital room with her grandfather Theodore, frail but proud, holding her hand through the final hour. Marcus wasn't there. He'd asked to be, through his lawyer, in a message Claire read twice before deciding, with the same careful clarity that had guided every decision since she'd found that ring on his desk in reverse, that some doors deserved to stay open, even for people who'd broken them. 4 months later, on a bright, cold afternoon, Marcus stood outside a coffee shop near Claire's new office, the address of the company headquarters unchanged, though almost everything inside it had transformed under her leadership: safer building practices, transparent environmental review, and a culture that no longer rewarded silence. He'd asked to see Josephine. Claire had agreed to supervised visits, slow and careful, the kind of arrangement built not on forgiveness, but on the practical understanding that a child deserved the chance to know her father, even a deeply flawed one, on terms that protected her first. Claire arrived carrying Josephine in a soft carrier, and for a moment, Marcus simply stared, struck by how much the baby's dark hair resembled his own, the detail Claire had come to share with him the very day she'd found him with someone else. "She has your stubborn chin," Claire said, allowing herself a small, tired smile as she settled into the chair across from him. "She has your eyes," Marcus said quietly, reaching out with visible restraint, waiting for permission before touching his daughter's hand for the first time. "You get 30 minutes, Claire said, setting a small timer on the table between them, not unkindly, simply the way she now handled every part of her life, deliberately, without apology. Marcus held his daughter for the first time, feeling the same crushing, humbling weight every ruined man feels when he finally understands exactly what he traded away for a fleeting, forgettable thrill. "I know sorry doesn't fix any of it," he said. "No," Claire agreed. "It doesn't. but showing up might, eventually, if you actually mean it this time. She didn't offer him forgiveness that afternoon. She offered him something rarer and harder to earn, a chance, small and conditional, to become someone worth forgiving. When the timer rang, she took Josephine back gently, gathered her things, and walked away without looking back, the same steady, unhurried pace she'd carried out of his office the day she left that ring behind. Marcus watched her go, understanding at last that the ring on that desk had never been the end of anything. It had been the exact moment his wife stopped waiting for him to become a better man and started becoming, entirely on her own, the woman who no longer needed him to. That is how Claire Voss turned a single, silent act of leaving a ring on a desk into the quiet, complete dismantling of the empire built on her silence. Marcus believed loyalty was something owed to him simply for the size of his name on a building. He forgot the most important truth in business and in marriage. The people closest to you are the only ones who truly know where the walls are weak. He lost the company his father built. He lost the marriage he stopped protecting years before he ever kissed another woman. And in the end, all he was left holding was 30 supervised minutes a week and the unbearable knowledge that he'd had everything that mattered, and let it walk out in an elevator while he stood frozen behind a desk. What would you have done in Claire's position? Would you have walked away quietly, or would you have burned it all down the way she did? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story of betrayal and quiet, devastating justice resonated with you, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more real-life drama every week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.